We're excited to bring you this new episode of Blue Sky, but before we do, here's a quick mention of another show we think our listeners might enjoy. The Mental Health, Hope, and Recovery podcast has something you won't find anywhere else. The uplifting voices of Helen Sneed and Valerie Milburn as they share their thriving lives in recovery. They're now flourishing following decades-long struggles with multiple mental health conditions. The Mental Health, Hope, and Recovery podcast shares an insider's approach to mental health, a host of recovery skills, knowledgeable, intriguing guests, and inspirational stories of recovery. Listen to all their episodes at mentalhealthhopeandrecovery.com or wherever you get your podcasts. From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. We've spoken many times in past Blue Sky episodes about the feeling many of us have that our society suffers from an increasing lack of togetherness and community. And while we tend to think these changes have come about in recent years, research points to them starting more than 50 years ago, in the early 1970s. Much of the best work on this subject was done by Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam and made well known in his 2001 book, Bowling Alone. Many years after this work was released, Professor Putnam had a particularly strong impact on one of his classroom students, today's Blue Sky guest. Pete Davis was so taken by Professor Putnam and the power of his ideas that he decided to team with his documentary producer sister, Rebecca, to create the award-winning film Join or Die. I've seen this movie and it's terrific, very entertaining, while simultaneously making the case that if we want to strengthen our democracy, we as individuals need to get back to engaging with others to create stronger neighborhoods and communities. Before making this film, Pete Davis worked on civic projects aimed at deepening American democracy and solidarity. He's the co-founder of the Democracy Policy Network, a state policy organization focused on raising up ideas that deepen democracy. In 2015, he co-founded Getaway, a company that provides simple, unplugged escapes to tiny cabins outside of major cities. His Harvard Law School graduation speech, A Counterculture of Commitment, has been viewed more than 30 million times and was recently expanded into a book, Dedicated, A Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. Pete's also the co-author of How to Get Away, Finding Balance in Our Overworked, Overcrowded, Always-On World. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Daily News, The Guardian, Fast Company, America Magazine, and the Falls Church News Press. Yes, Pete Davis is a young man of numerous achievements, and I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with him as much as I did. Pete Davis, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Hello, Bill. I'm so glad to be here.
It's been a pleasure getting to know you a little bit and a true pleasure to see your incredible film, Join or Die. And I'd like to talk about that. But before we get to it, I'd love to hear quickly about your background and how it was that you first met and came to be a huge fan of Robert Putnam.
Well, Robert Putnam, came into my life at a really pivotal point in my life. I was in my late teens. I was a young college student, and I had the joy of taking his kind of now famous seminar at college called epically Community in America.
Yeah.
And what I loved about that class is, I was a political science major. And what I loved about that class is most of the people that were into politics were into the centralized aspects of politics. Study the president, study Congress.
Right.
Maybe you study the economy, you study the Fed, you talk about war, you talk about parliamentary versus presidential systems. And what was so amazing about Bob's class is he was for the people that were into politics, but they were into it really on the ground. What is ordinary neighborhood connections? What is ordinary civic groups? How do social movements work? And his whole argument kind of opened up all my eyes that these ordinary neighbor to neighbor connections, the ways we connect with each other and then enter public life, has just as much to do, if not more, with the fate of our democracy than stuff going on at the White House.
Incredible. And by the time you took that class, he was a name, if you will. So Bowling Alone came out in 2001, which was really his seminal work that put him, he'd done a lot of great stuff before that, but that was really the big one. So by the time you took that class, he had some celebrity about him.
Yeah, it's very funny. You know, it's rare that a political scientist whose books are kind of like 500 plus page tomes filled with graphs and data ends up becoming famous. But he's one of the ones that broke through because he had this finding that put charts behind what so many people were feeling, which is, and just to share with listeners, the Bowling Alone finding was this kind of epic finding that over the last 50 years, on almost every measure of us interacting with our neighbors, connecting in clubs, connecting in congregations, connecting in unions, connecting in picnics. He even had picnic data, connecting in card playing at the house, connecting in coffee shops, you know, all the different ways we connect with each other has unfortunately been going down over the last half century. And he calls that bowling alone. You know, we're bowling just as much as we are before, but we're not bowling in teams. We're not bowling in leagues. We're bowling alone. And that really resonated with people and made, for many people, Bob a household name.
I have the picnic data right in front of me, actually. And I'm glad you said 50 years, because when we talk about sort of isolation and lack of community, a lot of us, and this is typical, I think, of the human race, we tend to think that things used to be so much better, but the last few years have been really bad. Well, this all started a long time ago. So picnics, 60% decline from the 70s to the 90s in picnics. So this is, you know, the usual bugaboos. This is pre-social media. This is pre, you know, if you will, like the current contentious politics. This goes way back. People taking leadership roles in any organizations, 50% decline from 1970 to 1990. 35% decline from the 60s to the 2020s in religious congregation membership. Is there something in Bob's research or in your thinking that you can point to and say, okay, this is when it started and why? In my lifetime, when I look at these years, I think of the early part of these spans and think Vietnam, Watergate, disillusionment. Is that part of it? Where does this all come from and why?
We are pretty confident on when. So it's, you know, we can kind of pinpoint it to the late 60s, early 70s when these numbers start peaking and going down across all these levels. And Bob shows through kind of dozens of different levels that, you know, we're seeing declines there. The question of why is a little harder. And we talk about in the movie that, you know, everyone has their own opinions about why. And you know, Bob even has some of his own inklings about why, but we can't stick it to one thing. Okay. The one that Bob featured in Bowling Alone that he did find like a substantial amount of evidence to was the introduction of television.
Yes.
And here's why he had an inkling about that, which was, you know, we had studies that showed, you know, first off, television exploded across the country in one decade.
Yes.
You know, we went from 10% of people having televisions to 90% of people having televisions. Yep. And so it is kind of like a seismic thunderclap of a new way people spent their evenings.
Yes.
And it was right before these declines started happening.
Right.
We also have data that showed that in regions that got television later, there might have been declines because of, you know, those regions declined later. And we also got that if more people watch television, you know, they were doing civics less. But Bob likes to say it's not the only story. It might have been the first nudge down the hill, but everything builds on each other. It's a vicious cycle, unfortunately, which is, you know, maybe you started watching TV a bit more and that made you care a little bit more about what's going on nationally instead of locally. Maybe that suddenly the national mood with Watergate and Vietnam started making you believe in public life a little bit less. Maybe culture started shifting. Maybe the declines in membership in these groups made them a little older so that when the kid wants to join, they feel a little bit more alienated by the group.
Yeah.
Maybe the group starts getting a little rusty and it's not innovating with the time, and on and on and on. You know, it starts, you know, I like the metaphor of it was like a civic unraveling. It wasn't like one person shot civics dead. It was that a string started being pulled and then suddenly the whole sweater rips. The but this is the Optimism Institute's podcast,
Yes,
and
bring
I
us
want
back,
to
Pete. Bring us back.
I want to. What's funny about making a movie about such a sad topic is my sister and I, who made the movie
Yes.
together, we're actually pretty hopeful people.
Yes.
And we wanted the movie not to be a doom and gloom movie. What we wanted to say was, this has happened. We have to admit that this has happened. We are in trouble. But the step after admitting that is starting to rejuvenate civic life in America. And the reason I'm bringing that up now in the conversation is that the way that civics declined is going to be the way that it rejuvenates, which is it's not going to be one silver bullet.
Yes.
Like if we all do X, civics will revive. It's going to be thousands of different projects, practices, programs all across the country that slowly help rebuild our civic muscle of connecting that builds on each other.
Yep.
And just like how there was an acceleration to the decline, I think there could be an acceleration to the rejuvenation.
Amen. There's so much to think about here. To start, I appreciate and agree with what Pete says about neighborly connections being more important than what happens in the White House. And as with so many of the problems we face today, the decline in civic engagement and community is not something new. And now with their film, the Davis siblings have joined Robert Putnam in doing a great job putting charts behind what we're all feeling. And the data do seem to point towards decline starting in the late 1960s, early 1970s, after televisions went from being in 10% of households to 90% in one decade. And from the 1970s to the 1990s, there was a 40% decline in people attending public meetings, a 60% decline in going to picnics, and a 50% decline in people taking any leadership positions in organizations. Left alone, this is discouraging stuff. But Pete Davis is an optimist, and with infectious hopefulness, he challenges us to start working on these deficiencies now. We can do it ourselves, and we don't need to wait on our government or other private or public institutions to get us started. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Pete to speak more directly about his movie. By the way, Join or Die, I looked it up before the call, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. I have seen it. It's a spectacular film, and you really make the case well, and it's also very entertaining, and you get to know Robert Putnam in the process too. And by the way, I use the word celebrity. He's about as un-celebrity-like as any famous person could be. He's just a lovely, down-to-earth person, and you really get that from the film. But what I'd like to ask you is, why does this matter? Who cares if we're not in as many clubs or we don't, join the school board the way we used to? What's the deleterious effect of this trend? What happens that's so bad?
Yeah, it's funny, Bob's very famous for this bowling alone phenomenon. And, when we were first coming up with this, many people thought, oh, just make a movie about his bowling alone work. But we actually ended up putting his bowling alone work as Act 2 of 3 in the movie. Act 3 of the movie is the Rejuvenation story. Act 2 is the story of this decline. But we really wanted to start in Act 1 with this lesser known study by Bob's that got him onto this topic in the first place, which was that Bob for 20 years, and this is going to get a little nerdy political science, but I think the listeners can handle it.
Yes.
I'll keep it quick. For 20 years, Bob's had this natural experiment in Italy where Italy had split up into regional governments. It was a centralized government, and suddenly it had states, like the American equivalent of states. Suddenly, out of nowhere in the 70s, it had a couple dozen regional governments. And he said, as a political, we'd look at that and say, okay, fine, something happened in another country. But Bob looked at that and said, oh, this is a perfect political science experiment because we can test, do some regions thrive and other regions languish over the coming 20 years? And what causes it? We can find out what makes a region work, what makes democracy work, what makes government work, what makes a community work. And so he studied them for 20 years. He was able to line them up from the most successful region, Emilia-Romagna, highest levels of happiness, highest levels of government satisfaction, most productive, most economic growth, to the lowest. Apologies to the people of Basilicata and Calabria, but they were the lowest. And then he was able to line them up. But most importantly, he was able to find out what correlated and with success and eventually what is the causal mechanism of the correlation. And what he found was it wasn't necessarily the design of the government. It wasn't necessarily economic growth. It wasn't necessarily the quality of the staff or even education. What it was the ordinary community cultural vibrancy of the region. If they had more bocce clubs, if they had more singing societies, if they had more local newspapers, if more people were hanging out in the plaza and talking, if more people were having over to each other's house for card games, it trickled up and out to be a successful community. And the way you can think about, and Bob calls this phenomenon social capital. Just like how economic capital, like money, helps you get something done, or physical capital, like a screwdriver, helps you get something done. Social capital, when a place has more trust, this is why we do team building exercises at work. When a place has more trust, more people can spread ideas faster. They take care of each other better. They smooth over differences easier. They watchdog each other more. They can work more fluidly, and they're more joyful in their life because community makes us joyful. And all of that leads to place working. And so if we have a huge decline in community connections, a decline in social capital, we're going to start seeing declines in government quality and economics and education and happiness and health. And that's what we've seen. And then the optimistic side is if we can start rebuilding those local community connections, we can start seeing a bunch of other things get better too.
And I'm glad you mentioned the health and happiness part too, because that's, you have the Surgeon General in the film and he's talking about the loneliness epidemic. And when you think about, I've watched the Blue Zone documentaries, I've read about that. When they go to these parts of the world, it's sort of like Robert did, but in a different way, go to these parts of the world where they have this unusual number of centenarians. And it's like, why is that? And obviously it's diet and exercise and stuff, but a huge one that they point to is community and friendships and groups. And the longitudinal study that was done at Harvard on the happiness, the longest one ever done, that's the thing they come back to. Relationships with other people, period.
Yeah, we have this fact right at the center of the film. It's part of the kind of shtick of calling the film Join or Die. In many ways, it's like join or our democracy dies. But a lot of it directly in your own individual life, your chances of dying in the next year are cut in half by joining one club or group.
I love that statistic. I saw that.
And it's amazing. If you found out that the chances of dying were cut in half by quitting smoking in the next year, we do a national campaign to quit smoking, which we did. If your chances of dying of childhood asthma were cut in half by having less smog, we'd have a national campaign to have less smog, which we did, or drunk driving, which we did, or eating healthier foods, which we do all the time. But community has just as much of a significant impact on health. And what Bob and the Surgeon General and a great researcher out of Brigham Young, Julianne Holt-Ludstad, have all been emphasizing is we need a giant public health campaign in addition, to all the other campaigns for community to talk about its connection to health and emphasize if you want to be a healthy person, you got to belong and join too.
And we're going to focus more on how we get out of this. But as you talk, I'm thinking too, you mentioned this unraveling, and I'm thinking about it in all these different sectors. So you mentioned television possibly, getting this ball rolling. And then I think even within television, at least in the earlier days, a third of the country was watching the same show.
Yes.
Or half. And you'd go to, the water cooler comment. You go to work the next day and talk about MASH the night before. Now it's, what are you streaming? And it's something you've never heard. Everything's fragmented, right? So that's one. Architecture, front porches versus back porches.
Yes.
We were a country of front porches, and obviously there's still plenty of front porches around, but architects started to move it towards back porches or atriums instead of playgrounds, right? And then I think about remote work. And so, or watching your movie. I feel terrible. I didn't bowl alone, but I watched your movie alone. We can watch movies alone. You used to have to go with a big group of people and you'd all laugh at the same time. You'd all cry at the same time. So it feels like it unravels in all these different sectors. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah. I always say, one of my favorite ideas is that what we desire is connected to how we design our world around us. And then that also in turn changes what we desire and want. So people start joining less and being less communal. And then entities start designing spaces, or corporations start designing products, or media starts designing culture, to be like, oh, people are much more individualist now. Let's build things for them. But then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're
Yes.
surrounded in a world that makes you live alone, you'll suddenly say, oh, well, that's what life's about. And one of the emphases of this film is, the number one goal of this film, I literally say at the beginning of the film, so it's not a spoiler, this is a film about why you should join a club. We want you to nudge to change your life. But the secondary goal of this is to help people put on what I call the community lens, in what they're, to look at the way we're designing all the parts of our world, what you're literally doing in your work or in your leadership in your town or sector. Can you design it with community in mind? And can you notice how your designs are affecting community? And you pointed out a few of these, but you can go sector by sector and think about it. Literally the design of houses can be more communal or less communal. I think about David Brooks said, we are in the era of back patio man. He called them, we used to be front porch people and now we're patio man. Is, the grill on your back patio, not the grill at the Eagles Hall, is, for people you already know, not people you could meet. The design of urban spaces, like, are we having more walkable neighborhoods where people can meet each other on big sidewalks and plazas? The design of our education system. School is not just, here's a really sad thing I've heard about schools recently. A lot of schools have a policy that the kids can have cell phones in school, but they can't use them in class. They can only use them in the cafeteria or in the hallway.
Yeah.
And I go, well, the cafeteria and the hallway is a huge part of the curriculum of school. I would say it's the most important part of the curriculum of school.
Yes.
It's where you learn the most important skill, which is being awkward and having awkward conversations with each other, where you might be bored or not entertained or not, calmed for a moment. And so if you put on the community lens, you'd say, we should definitely, if we think it's really important for kids to learn things, they can't learn things when the phones are there, then the cafeteria is a place of learning, and like, that's where it matters. So you can see how you could start making different decisions when you put on the community lens. And so that's one of our goals with the movie too.
I've often described adopting an optimistic outlook as a selfish act in some ways. After all, it makes you feel better and can even extend your life. Likewise, the film Join or Die makes a compelling case that not only will joining a club or participating in other community efforts improve our culture, but it can even cut your own chances of dying in the next year. Pretty good incentive, I'd say. And it really is amazing when you add up the many ways our culture seems to contribute to our insularity and division. From back porches to fragmented TV and movie viewing options. And with Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation making waves by encouraging phone-free schools, it's particularly interesting to hear Pete home in on the destructive middle ground between full phones and no phone policy, saying giving them back only at lunchtime is the worst possible policy. Our Blue Sky conversation turned next to talking about clubs. So when you say clubs or join a club and your chance of dying get cut in half for that year, paint a picture for us, because I think one of the problems is, in my view, is we've become a little bit jaded, a little bit cynical, because some of the clubs you talk about, it's Odd Fellows and Rotary and things that for a lot of people, oh, that's kind of old fashioned. That's what my grandfather did. I think that's part of the issue. Can you talk about the kinds of clubs? If someone's listening to this and saying, gosh, I should do something. What advice do you have? Now we're in let's pull out of this section of our conversation.
Yeah, I'll start by just saying, as you know from your TV career, the job of media is simplicity, and we have to, you have to stop. We can't list off all the types of clubs when we say this is a film about why you should join congregations, communities, unions, professional associations, civic action committees, and the like. But we mean club in a shticky way to mean any type of organization where you're joining together. And even using the term organization, that fades out into like things that don't even resemble organizations. Like if you are a regular at a bar or cafe and you start getting to know people there, or if you're part of a music scene or a stand-up scene in a region, that's also a gathering place. Or if you're just like getting your neighbors together for potlucks all the time, it might not be an official named org with a president, vice president, and a treasurer, but that's all what we're getting at. Anything that brings people together in community. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we want to emphasize that these historic clubs like Kiwanis, Rotary, Oddfellows, Masons, and the like, Elks, all the animal clubs. Bob likes to say Elks, Moose, Eagles, things like that. Lions. Many of them are still going and they're still wonderful. So I'm never going to dissuade someone from joining one of them. They've shown our movie a lot. There are some that have pulled off being intergenerational. But our real message is not that you necessarily, to be communal, again, have to join these old clubs. The world does not have to resemble, and it definitely shouldn't resemble, the high point of social capital, which was the 50s and the early 60s. A lot of problems that we've solved from that time.
Yes.
The challenge is to take that spirit of community, what Bob called civic creativity that led people to invent those clubs. The Rotary Club, which now has millions of members all around the world, was started with one guy going to lunch with 4 people on a monthly basis. And take that spirit and plant seeds in the new soil of today. So what's been so fun about touring this film is people have come up to me and they said, I started the state skate club. I started this pickleball league. We bought out an old dying fraternal organization lodge, and we turned it into something that works for young people. And that's the spirit, is think about what you love and how you could do what you love together with other people today. It doesn't need to be changing yourself. It can be raising the flag of anyone else interested in this in our play, in the city, and then seeing who shows up. And you'll always be surprised who shows up.
It's so funny you just said pickleball, because obviously it's booming. And I just talked to someone the other day who said he took up pickleball largely because it's a great way to meet people.
Amen.
Okay. There aren't a lot of sort of physical, at sports, you don't necessarily play pickup basketball to meet people. It's probably guys you've already met, right? And same guys every time. You go these round robin pickleball tournament, it's co-ed. So you can meet men, you can meet women. It's very accessible physically. People who are not the greatest athletes are the greatest athletes. So sitting here thinking about it for the first time, but this could be the secret sauce of pickleball or one of these things. Like you said, it's not necessarily Kiwanis, but this could be one of those things that starts pulling us out.
Yeah, and with the exception of those kind of people that hit the pickleball against the wall, you can't really play pickleball alone. It has that advantage over bowling. You have to play,
but I'm told like singles is nowhere near as fun as doubles. So you can have 4 people, right? That's a plus.
So that's a spirit, and that's exactly the spirit here. We're definitely not saying you have to bowl together. Just do something together. And so, and what you'll discover, what I love about pickleball and what I love about Bob's example of bowling is, I think there's a spirit in our time where people feel like everything has to have this like very distinctive purpose of how it's going to serve my individual journey. I'll join a group if it's going to help me with networking, or I'll join a group if we can all learn skills together because of my health. What the most successful community groups in the past were, and the most successful community groups that are being revived today, is they're a little useless, because in that space of their uselessness, of how goofy it is to go bowling or how goofy it is to play pickleball, the thing that fills the space is community, because there's no point in taking it too seriously, because the spirit is like, we're all trying to have fun here. So
and maybe they're making a comeback. I feel like I'm hearing about it more, like book clubs. You talk to people who are in book clubs. Some of the best book clubs, no one talks about the book. It's just an excuse to get together. And you mentioned potluck too. I don't know if you've read Rainn Wilson's book. He's the guy, he wrote a book called Soul Boom. He's the guy who played, I'll forget the name of the character in The Office. Fascinating guy. And he talked about if he could start a new religion, here's what the rules would be. And he goes through, it's a little bit, it's pretty funny and sort of out there. But one of the things he said is a non-negotiable is that it will have potlucks.
Yes.
And first, I laugh like that. And then he's like, no, here's the thing with potlucks. Brings people together. They bring their own recipe, often that has a family story
Yeah.
attached to it or an ethnic story attached to it or something. He said potlucks could change the world, basically.
Amen. What I
Right?
love about them, there should be a name for this. It's like potluck like things. That's why I love Halloween, or why I love parades. Potlucks, parades, and Halloween. What do they all have in common? It's a thing that you're doing for the community together. It's a thing that ends with all of you coming together and enjoying, the thing that's created, the food or the costumes, the whole experience, or the parade. But you bring your own individual personality to it. You bring your own
Right.
dish. Kid designs their own costume. You bring your own float to the parade. And what that shows is that, a lot of people think that community is the opposite of individualism. But what I've discovered from studying under Bob and making this film and thinking a lot about this is that they're actually completely intertwined, that we become our full individual personalities through community. That community is the venue in which we develop who we are. It's the venue in which we find our own individual journey of heroism. If you bring the best dip to the potluck, everyone celebrates you. It doesn't matter if you made the absolute best dip in the world if you're eating it alone. It's only through supporting these moments of community that, there are what makes up an exciting life journey. And so I don't think we need to be scared that community is going to be a place that we're going to lose ourselves in through hyperconformity. I think it's going to be a place where we actually develop ourselves.
I'm one of those people who's definitely been guilty of pulling back from clubs and other associations. So it was encouraging to hear Pete say that he's not saying we all have to go join a club per se, though that would be great. Really, it's being part of any activity that brings people together that will help. And as a metaphor for getting started today, I love his phrasing when he encourages us to plant seeds in the soil of today. And for all you fans of The Office listening in and likely yelling Dwight when I couldn't remember Rainn Wilson's character on the show, you're right. That's who he played. And I do recommend his book, Soul Boom. It's a different, quirky, and kind of brilliant work, just like the author himself. Now, back to our conversation. One of the many things I enjoyed about the film was it is fairly intimate with Robert in times, and you did a lot of the work during the pandemic. And anytime you see a pandemic setting and masking and everything, it just sort of takes you back. It wasn't that long ago, but sometimes it seems like eons ago. And I'd love to talk about the pandemic because, as I said before, we talked about this stuff started a long time ago, and it's still too early probably to know all the impacts of the pandemic. On the one hand, I'm assuming it pulled us possibly even farther apart. But then on the other hand, I'm thinking there may have been some silver linings or consolation prizes coming out the other side. For example, you and I are talking right now on a platform that, we wouldn't have even thought about before the pandemic. We're not in the same room, but we're having a little community here. Can you tell me about sort of what, at least early on, you think the impacts of the pandemic have been?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that, I like to emphasize to everyone, we were already in decline before the pandemic. So the pandemic didn't cause this decline, but a lot of community is based in routine and habit and ritual. Think about a club meeting.
Yes.
The club meets every first Thursday of every month or something, or the congregation meets every Friday or something. And it interrupting a routine is easier than rebuilding a routine. And one of the worst things that came out of the pandemic is so many civic and communal routines were interrupted and then never picked up again when we could meet in person, even though people valiantly tried to make it all work on Zoom. So that's the downside. And with that downside has come a seed of a hopeful thing, which is that I think people really felt they came to awareness of the loneliness we were feeling during the pandemic and even before the pandemic. And if you came into the pandemic not being acutely aware of the importance of community, we are all kind of exiting the pandemic, becoming very acutely aware of the importance of community. I have an insight into that a little more than the average person because I'm making a movie about community and everyone wants to talk about it. And everyone, when I say I'm making a movie about community, 5 years ago, when I said I'm making a movie about community, people are like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's a topic. Yeah, I guess that's a thing in life. Now, when you say I'm making a community about isolation, community goes, oh, of course. Yes, that's exactly what we're all thinking about it. It's been so that's very hungry. That's the thing people are very hungry for. Um, the thing on Zoom and tech is we have all this technology that connects us, and I really like Bob's take on technology, which we didn't get much of it in the film, but his take on technology is that if the technology is supporting you in making and keeping real relationships with real people that can head towards sharing your full self with each other, then the tech is good for community. If it's flattening your sense of
Yes.
what community is to, I have a community of fellow people who love Beyonce and the million of us all like her posts, those other people are not bringing you soup when you're sick. They're not people you're celebrating with. They're not people who are there for you in hard times. They're not people that are checking you when you become wayward. They're not people who are inspiring you to be better. That's not a community. And one of the things that one of my pet peeves is we got to reclaim the word to really mean it's pushing you towards real relationships in a deep way. And so if the Zoom is keeping your book club going when someone's away and you're still loving each other and connected with each other, good on Zoom. If it's a thing that you're saying, I shouldn't drive across town to be with someone in person because we can always Zoom, then the Zoom is bad for community. So that's how we got to think about it.
That's a great way of thinking about it. No, it's a great way of thinking about it. And I think about the earlier days of social media when my kids, who were, gosh, they're probably your age, were getting on social media, and it was this race to see who had more friends. And he's got 903 friends. And I'd say, he doesn't have 903 friends. That might be what Facebook calls them. But back to your point, are they going to bring him soup when he's sick? And I don't think half those people even know where he lives. So
Yes.
I think that's very valuable. So you talked about going around the country with the film. Can you tell us, you were kind enough to send me a link so I could watch it alone. How could someone listening to this go see your movie? Can you tell us about that?
Bill, you are catching us, and listeners, you are catching us at the best time to ask that question.
Here we go.
Which is
breaking news once again on the Optimism Institute.
Right now, we are totally open for any requests to have this film be shown in your community.
Great.
So if you go to joinorDie.film, there's a form right on our website where you can just fill it out, say, I want to show this at my book club. I want to show this at my company. I want to show this at my Rotary Club or my whatever. We're going to big conferences where 1,000 people will be there to book clubs where 5 people will be there. And we have kind of a sliding scale to make that all work. Because if we're going to make a film about community, we don't want everyone watching it, only
Yes.
Bill can watch it alone for now. We want people having the film not only teach you about community, but be an excuse to meet up with people to watch it together. So head over to joinorDie.film and fill out that form.
.film, because everyone's going to do .com, joinorDie.film.
And we're pretty high on Google. If you type in Robert Putnam documentary or Bowling Alone documentary, It'll be the first hit. So we're there. I
love that idea. And you're talking about, now I'm just thinking about more ways that community could come back together. I was an athlete growing up, and I think about, in the early days, you'd have your town's little league and you'd have your school teams. And now there are these travel teams and, ways of literally dividing the kids up to the point where you're playing with kids you don't go to school with. The parents are in the bleachers. They don't necessarily know each other. So even that is something that seems to be changing. And I think if people would go on joinorDie.film and check this out, they would start thinking about these things differently. It's hugely valuable.
I'm filled with these community anecdotes, so I'll cut me off whenever you want to, Bill. But since you mentioned being an athlete, were you a high school athlete?
I was.
That is this is a perfect example of how you could put on the community building lens. There is no reason why necessarily, if you aren't thinking about community and its importance, to attach sports teams to high schools. Right. The place where you learn chemistry is also the place where you play football, or, the place where you're doing algebra is also the place where you have plays. This doesn't make any sense. But a lot of people at the turn of the last century had the great idea that when a place feels more of a sense of belonging, more people are attached to all the parts of the place. And so they attached all these community activities like theater and sports to high schools. And it's and it's not the case in other countries. If you talk to people in other countries, not all high schools have sport league attached to them.
No.
And it's a great advantage of American education, because think of all those moments where you're like, I don't really want to try in chemistry today, but because I'm on the soccer team, and I have all these friends there and they make me happy about going to school because I have the soccer team that is a community, I'll try a little harder in chemistry today. And it's a perfect example of how adding a little spice of a community to any institution makes all the parts of the institution get better.
And it's funny. I wonder if that's the roots too. If you think about it, when else do you hear the national anthem but before a sporting event?
Yes. Yeah, no, it makes you feel more connected to your country. This is one of the big emphasis of, community theorists, is that our connections to large scale things usually are not from the top down, they're from the bottom up. When you feel connected to your family, it helps you get connected to your neighborhood, which helps you get connected to your city and your state and your country, and that helps you get connected to the world.
Yeah.
And, that's all part of this. How can we use the benefits of belonging to help get things done together?
Yeah, because I'm wondering if some of the things that are still bringing people together these days, some of the ones are some of the more divisive ways potentially, right? So people are hardcore in their political party, hardcore in their view on this social issue. They wear it on their sleeve. When I was a kid, I didn't know who my parents' friends voted for or where they stood, right? And now it's like, they're a so-and-so and they're a so-and-so, right? And so it seems like even some of the things that are hanging together are ones that we'd really like to do a little bit more mixing.
Yeah. And, some people, we get this question a lot, which is, aren't there bad clubs? And yes, there are very bad clubs. By our definition of a club and by Bob's definition of social capital, really evil clubs like the Ku Klux Klan are a club. So, I want to acknowledge that. But one of the things we like to emphasize, we've been emphasizing on the tour, is that the lack of community actually empowers the most extremist clubs. Because when you have no belonging in your life, the first person that shows up to your door and says, I'm going to give you a big hardcore dose of belonging and a dose of meaning and a dose of purpose because we're going to do this extreme thing together. Suddenly you're that's like someone giving you a gallon of water in the desert, and you're going to go with them and turn off your brain and not think about, oh, is this wrong? When you're part of a congregation or part of a book club, or you're part of the Rotary Club, or you're part of this, that, or the other, and you're filled up with belonging and purpose and meaning, suddenly when that person comes to your door, you say, I'm fine, thank you. I already got my belonging and my meaning here. And so we're actually at risk of really extreme versions of community that are kind of antisocial when we don't have enough pro-social, nice versions of community.
As optimists, we're often looking for silver linings during tough times. And from the pandemic, we can take as a positive the fact that it sharpened our attention on our increasing sense of isolation from our neighbors and fellow community members. And it wouldn't be a Blue Sky episode, it seems, without a mention of social media. And I really liked what Pete said about how Robert Putnam evaluates individual technologies. If it helps you gain or maintain real relationships, that's great. But if it builds a lighter, less real form of individual connection, like an online fan club, that's less so. And when we add up the many reasons why a person's sense of being part of a strong community can be helpful, what Pete said about lack of community making people vulnerable to extremism is really striking. Now, to our final segment with Pete Davis. So Pete, you and your sister made this incredible film, and you're out promoting and doing these community events. What else are you doing to try to impact on this issue, or just in general in your incredibly energetic and exuberant life?
What's so wonderful is there are these waves of community spirit that come every 30, 40, 50 years or so. Yes. And what my sister and I have seen on our tour, and we hope the film is part of this latest wave, is that there is a wave that's growing across the country. There are senators that are starting to get interested in community policy. Obviously, we've mentioned the Surgeon General has gotten into this. More institutions are starting to think about how can our institution care about community. We're starting to see like almost every conference's theme this year is about togetherness and community. I think people are really hungry for this. And so in our other parts of our life, we're trying to support support that growing movement. We hope the movie can be supportive of it. But, the movie's kind of at the highest level of like, just get people on board this big ship of community spiritedness. The real work is going to be done in every local area and in every local institution of thinking about creative new ways we can bring people together. And I just want to do everything I can to support all the different people thinking up stuff like that. Can I give you one example? Just, I'm talking very
Please.
abstractly, but people like concrete examples.
Yes.
We know for a fact that one of the leading, I talk about education a lot, but here's another education example.
Yes.
One of the leading determinants of educational success is the community that a kid is embedded in while they're in school.
Sure.
Even more than the quality of the teacher, or the quality of the curriculum, or the quality of the building or something. It's, are they embedded in a community that's supporting that education? And
Yes.
so we know that's a fact. And so what some daycares have started to do, like young, 2 to 5 year olds daycares, they've started to do is, we're not just going to provide daycare to the kids. We're going to throw a party for the parents every so often to make sure that the parents in these daycares become friends with each other. Because, and that little change of suddenly, 3 of the parents get to know each other. Suddenly they have play dates together. Suddenly when one parent is struggling, the other 2 parents can help them out. That is very significant for the quality, the quality of that kid's experience of daycare. And that's what I mean by the community lens. You think, oh, well, the purpose of daycare is to be daycare for the kid during the day. But think about the broader thing that everything is embedded in, and what are tiny nudges you can do to change that. And if you're a daycare provider and you're thinking, oh, that's burdening me too much with even more work, one of the joys of community is spreading the work around. So it might not be even you have to throw the party. Can you recruit one of the parents to be the parent chair to throw the party? What I've found is that everyone is so completely hungry for community that they want to be asked to participate in community. We all think we're going to be burdening people.
Right.
We're burdening them by not asking them for connection and help.
Right. Right. No, it's a great example. I did some coaching when our kids were little, and when I first did it, I liked the sports I was coaching. I want to be around my kids, and a dad said, "It's great that you're doing this." And he was old; his kids were older. He said, "I did that too." And he said, "There's no better way to get to know your kids' friends and their parents." Right. And for better or worse, you figure out which parent always forgets to pick the kid up after practice and everything. But it was true. And he said, I was coaching little kids, they're the same in 4th grade as they are in 12th grade for a large, and I got to know kids and parents in a way I couldn't have if I hadn't been involved. So there are all these other benefits, but in terms of a community thing, it was great. And it was a town team. It wasn't, a bunch of kids from other towns.
And all of that, one of the things Bob has found is that all of that not only helps the people inside the community connections, it helps everyone around them too.
Sure.
That's what's so amazing about community and social capital is because you built those community connections and more people are watchdogging, more things going on around town, and more people are caring for each other, and more people are feeling a little more connected to this town, and maybe they put a little extra effort in. Suddenly that ripple effect ripples out to everyone. And so, there's just such a power to networks.
So Robert Putnam, I believe, is retired from Harvard. Is he still researching and writing, or is the torch being passed to the Pete Davis generation? Or bring us up to date on that.
Yeah, Bob we actually captured his final class in our recording for this documentary. As part of the reason we did it now is he was in a reflective mood because he was at the end of his teaching career. Bob is not at the end of his preacher career. He's going around the country to a lot of events in his 80s, talking about the gospel of community. He's also still writing articles, thinking about questions for this, mentoring the next generation. There's now 2 generations below him of people. We tried to feature the next generation after him, which is, people like Hari Hahn and Xavier D'Souza Briggs, who are in the film, who are doing current community research. And then there's now a new generation of people in their 20s and 30s that are kind of starting up in community too. So there's a real legacy that Bob, Bob didn't invent the idea of community. He didn't invent the idea of social capital, but he is probably of all people the greatest popularizer and evangelizer of this idea. And there's a real legacy river flowing out of all of his work.
Well, Pete, his ideas are in great hands with you. And, I guess I'm closer to Robert's generation than yours probably. And you get to be my age. And it's always great to talk to younger people who have this kind of vision and enthusiasm. Because I get in that, get off my lawn age of life. And seeing people like you doing the work you do and putting the kind of energy you put into that film and this message, it's really inspiring. And I really appreciate you taking time to have this conversation.
Thank you, Bill. So appreciate what you're doing and the spirit you're bringing to all these podcasts and all your listeners is a key prerequisite for rebuilding community. We have to have kind of a spirit of believing things can get better to start acting.
Well, let's stick together and we'll stay in touch. And joinordie.film. Check it out now. Thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you.
Like I've discovered with my own work on optimism, Pete has found through his efforts that there's a real hunger out there for greater connection and community. And an advocacy from prominent figures like the Surgeon General highlighting loneliness as a serious health issue can only help. And again, our small actions can help, like Pete's examples of daycare centers making efforts to bring parents together, not just their kids. And a great effort that Blue Sky listeners can make is to put together a group and watch Rebecca and Pete Davis's terrific film. So go online and check out joinordie.film to figure out how you can do it. I hope you enjoyed and were inspired by this Blue Sky conversation with Pete Davis. Before you go, please leave us a rating or review and let us know how you think we're doing. And if you don't already, consider following the Optimism Institute on social media and go to our website to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, Blue Sky Weekend. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.